Thank you for joining us today. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Hi, I'm Angela O from the Pew Charitable Trusts. I work on the State Fiscal Health Project, which helps states advance data-driven decisions to build fiscally well-managed states. Thank you for attending this webinar. Policymakers are confronted with many budget challenges, which have been further exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. During this webinar, we will discuss how Utah's stress testing exercises and pre-recession planning have helped the state navigate these trying times, and how other states can perform similar exercises. Today's discussion will also include lessons learned from the Great Recession that are informing how states are budgeting today, common problems states are facing, and how comprehensive stress tests can guide budget policy. Today we'll hear from Jonathan Ball, Utah's legislative fiscal analyst. Jonathan also served as staff on the Joint Economic Committee of the U.S. Congress, the Washington office of Michigan Governor John Engler, the U.S. Department of Commerce, and the White House Office of Management and Budget. We'll also hear from Maddy Oritt, staff economist at Utah's Office of the Legislative Fiscal Analyst. Maddy also served as director of the Pac-12 Academic Leadership Coalition. And we'll also hear from Juliette Tennert, chief economist at the Gardner Policy Institute at the University of Utah. Juliette also served as the state budget director and chief economist for Utah Governor Gary Herbert, chief economist for Utah Governor John Huntsman, and as a fiscal analyst for the Utah State Legislature. Juliette will moderate today's discussion and will also provide remarks on the current economic outlook. We'll address questions after the presentations, but you can submit one at any time by clicking on the gray control panel on the right side of your screen. Once you do so, enter your query in the questions box. We ask that you please include your state. And lastly, please note that today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted to Pew's website. I'll now turn things over to Juliette to kick things off.
All right, thank you, Angela. Over the 15 or so years that I've been involved in state budgeting, I've witnessed ever-increasing complexity and greater demands on scarcer and scarcer resources. And I appreciate all of the research and analysis that the Pew Charitable Trust provides to support informed decisions in state fiscal policy. As Angela mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic has only intensified the challenges that state policymakers face. While Utah has certainly not been immune to the health and economic impacts of the pandemic, its practice of state budget stress testing, that is examining how prepared the state is to handle both the revenue shortfalls and increased expenses of an economic contraction, has proven to be an important tool over the past several months. And I think now I've counted, we're up to 4 special sessions. In order to set the stage for John and Maddy, I would like to provide a quick economic update. And if we can push the slides to the next graph. There we go, thank you. The economic impact of the pandemic was swift and severe, unlike any we've seen before. Between the first and the second quarters of the year, retail sales fell by 7%, with restaurants and bars taking the biggest beating. Personal income, exclusive of transfer receipts like Social Security and unemployment insurance payments, shrank over 6%. Farm proprietors saw their earnings cut by a third. And so very severe impacts, diversity in the impacts, but really severe across the board. Let's go to the next slide. As of early September, the National Conference of State Legislators reported that 38 states had downgraded their revenue projections by an average of 11%. As you'll hear from John and Maddy, these types of revenue shortfalls are only exacerbated by increases in demand for government services. Next slide. After these gloomy pictures that I've painted, it's important to acknowledge that the economic outlook is improving, but it's still cloudy with uncertainty. At the beginning of 2020, participants in the Wall Street Journal's monthly survey of economists, about 70 economists, predicted that the US unemployment rate would be 3.6% at the end of the year. By May, as we struggled to understand what was happening, predictions averaged 11.4%, with a 26 percentage point range. In part due to the massive fiscal stimulus we've experienced, we don't expect that that May prediction will come true. But between the path of the virus, vaccine development, the election, the future of fiscal stimulus, there's still a great deal of risk and uncertainty. So painting that picture, I'll turn the time over to John to share with us, given the current landscape, why budget stress test. And as we're pulling his slides up, I just want to remind participants that you should go ahead and submit any questions that you have via the question function. And as Angela said, please include your state when you do that. So John, talk to us about why are you doing what you're doing?
Well, sure. Before I do that, I just wanted to say, I think you must be wrong on your accounting of time there, Juliette, because you said you had 15 years of budgetary experience, and I've only been, out of school for about 5 years, and I think I gave you your first job in fiscal. So that we could go back.
Thank you, John. Thank you. I was worried that I did my math wrong, and I'm glad you double checked that for me.
I think we'll reconcile that later. Well, thanks. Thank you for asking, and I'm happy to share what we did. And we've talked about this many times before. I'm sure those on the video conference webinar have heard it before, but this time we actually did something with the stress tests, and that's what I'm excited about talking to you about. So I want to start out by saying, how did we get into this? And this goes a bit to the lessons learned from the Great Recession. About 10 years ago, a anxious and driven young freshman legislator came to my office and said, hey, Jonathan, when did you know that the state was in the Great Recession? And, it's one of those moments, it's like the Columbia, well, see, maybe it wasn't 5 years. It's like when the Columbia blew up, right? You know where you were, or when President Reagan was shot, you knew where you were, at least I did. So I knew where I was. I was in Alaska. I was at Denali National Park, and it was August 2008, and our chief economist called and said, we got a problem, and you got to come back. And of course, I ribbed her a little bit by saying, is me coming back going to stop the recession, or how's that? In any case, that I knew that was when it happened. And he said, this young legislator said, I knew a year earlier than you did in my private business. And how did you survive the recession in the state government? And I said, well, I don't know. We did exactly, we did what we always do. We made it up. We just made it up as we went. And he said, well, let's figure out how in the next little while, next 5 to 10 years, let's figure out how we get early warnings in the state government of recession. And then let's come up with a plan to survive them. And that's when this whole thing started. And so really the plan sort of culminates in the stress test. And what is a stress test? Just so that people are aware of this. We thought the Dodd-Frank stress tests for banks were a really good model to use for state government. And so basically all we do is we take our revenue forecasts and we substitute in the forecasts. At the first time we did it, we substituted the Dodd-Frank Act economic scenarios, economic indicators. Every one of your states I know has a revenue forecast, and every one of those revenue forecasts includes economic indicators, and it's a pretty simple task. Well, I say that, I didn't have to do it, Maddy did. But it's a pretty simple task to substitute these alternative scenarios in your revenue estimate. So we did that. I think the novel thing was here We also substituted those economic indicators in our cost estimates, because as everybody on this webinar knows, government demands are counter-cyclical to the economy, yet our revenues are pro-cyclical. And so we did both sides of the equation. We tried to figure out what was our value at risk. And then we said, okay, well, what do we have in reserve, and is it enough? And I don't just mean formal rainy day funds when I say reserve. We'll get into that in just a minute. So that's what a budget stress test is. Go to the next slide. So why did we do this? I mean, the first reason we did it is because the legislature makes us, right? So if there are any legislators on the call, if you want to know why your staff would do it, you can require that they do it. But we sort of like doing it, and we're glad that we have authorization in statute to do it every year. Why do we really do it? Next bullet, Angela. The reason we do it for real is we know the business cycle isn't dead, right? Now in 2014 and 15, when we started doing this, you might have thought the business cycle was dead. Well, everybody knows that since March, it's not. But back then we were in sort of this slow growth, slow climb out of the Great Recession, and everybody thought the sky was the limit. But we know the business cycle isn't dead. And let me show you what I mean by that. So next slide. So this is recessions in the United States since about 1947. And those are the bars, the vertical bars. And then the blue line, that's the US economy, GDP. Again, back to lessons learned by the Great Recession. This is what it looked like in 2008 when we were budgeting for the next 5 years or so in Utah. And next slide, or next transition. This is what we thought we were going to face. This is where we thought we were going, this lighter colored line. And so we made budgets based on that line. And we made a lot of promises in those budgets. Next, Angela. That's what really happened, though. And that is the problem that we were trying to avoid with budget stress tests. The business cycle will come back around every once in a while. And if you hit the next transition, Angela, you'll see this is, had you done stress testing and some of the other tools, you might have, and had you thought longer term about what's happening in the economy, you might have set your baseline like this instead of the light blue line. And then next transition, you could have avoided this little parallelogram, because that's basically dashed expectations. Those are promises that legislators made thinking they would have a bunch of money because we as analysts told them they would, and they didn't. Next slide. Okay, so why manage the business cycle is the first reason, the real reason. The second real reason, the third on this slide, is we want to keep those promises, right? So that I mentioned that before, but let me show you a little bit what I mean. Next slide. So this is real per pupil spending, inflation adjusted per pupil spending in Utah. And of course, Utah is the lowest per pupil spending in the nation. I know everybody has one of these measures that public ed points out, whatever it is, but ours is lowest per pupil spending in the nation. And this is where we were in 2008 as well. And man, I remember those days. We thought we were making such good progress in 2006, 2007, and 2008. And finally, we've broken out of this pattern of being the lowest, and maybe we can get to 49. Next transition. This is what happened, right? We were fooling ourselves. And it was because we were collecting real tax revenue on fake wealth back in 2008. And we were making promises to public ed that we couldn't keep. Next transition, and it wasn't the first time, right? We'd also done that in 2001 during the dot-com bust. So you can see we're maybe doing that again now in 2020. this is the kind of thing that we wanted to avoid. We want to avoid making promises and hopefully keep this 2020 trend upward rather than dipping down in the next 5 to 10 years. Next slide. Okay, and then finally, why we do it is to avoid crisis-driven policies. So, you know, we all make silly choices sometimes, and usually it's when the stakes are high and stress is high. I mean, there may have been some states that sold their capital and leased it back maybe during the Great Recession. There certainly are some states that issued revenue anticipation bonds, definitely states that used their retirement trust fund to pay for current expenses or didn't pay their ARC on their retirement to pay for current expenses. These are not good long-term fiscal decisions, but they're driven by the moment, and we wanted to avoid having that kind of pressure and maybe offering more options to policymakers when things go bad. So that's the why.
That's great. Thanks, Jonathan. You make a really good case for the why. Let's turn the time over to Maddy to explain how your office actually implements this budget stress test.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So next slide. So I'm going to start by talking about what we do in the before times, and then we can talk a little bit more about the pandemic version. So we've done this several times. Every iteration, we kind of refine it and tune it a little bit more. So this past one, which we conducted at the end of last calendar year, we purchased scenarios from Moody's Analytics, and we were looking at 3 scenarios. So we thought that our baseline at that time was going to be some moderate growth. And then we were looking at an adverse scenario, which would be a moderate recession, and a severely adverse scenario, which would be a more protracted slump. So similar duration of recession, just a longer, slower recovery out of that. And we look at a 5-year time frame. Next slide. Okay, so we work together with 2 other entities, the Utah Governor's Office of Management and Budget and the Utah State Tax Commission, so we collaborate on this project. So first we look at the revenue side, and we make our assumptions about what our scenarios are going to look like, and then each entity goes out and estimates specific indicator variables. So on the revenue side, that's going to be things like employment, personal income, retail sales, population, the stock market, things like that. So we have 3 separate forecasts on that. We come together, we come to consensus, and then we break out again. Each entity will estimate the trajectories for each of the scenarios for our big buckets. So sales tax, individual income tax, corporate income tax, and then other, which is just kind of our catch-all for our smaller revenue streams. And then we come to consensus on that. Next slide. So expenditure side looks pretty much the same. We set our scenarios, we go out and estimate our indicators. We're using similar indicators on the expenditure side. So things like employment and unemployment, personal income, births, population, and the stock market. Come to consensus on those, and then we use those indicators in our forecast for the different scenarios. And we kind of look at big buckets here. What are the countercyclical programs and then the really big cost drivers in our state government? So that's things like Medicaid, which is obviously very countercyclical, higher education, employee retirement costs. And then we include public education too. That's an enrollment-driven program, and it's such a huge part of our state budget that we want to make sure we are accounting for that as well. Next slide. Okay, so these are just a couple visualizations, some of our indicators just to give you a sense of what we were looking at last year. So I apologize for the colorblind folks, excuse me, which includes Jonathan, unfortunately, but that lowest line, which is kind of a cyan color, was our baseline for our unemployment rate. And then you can see the middle line, the navy, was our moderate recession scenario, and then that top jagged one was our protracted slump. So that goes a little bit higher, the duration is longer, and that recovery is obviously much slower and doesn't make it back to the baseline by the end of our time horizon. Next slide. So this is wages. Again, the top line here is our baseline, and then you can see both of those dips down for our moderate recession and then the deeper dip for our protracted slump scenario. Next slide. Okay, so these were our results back in December. So the y-axis here is our total revenue. So what we're really looking at is the area between the curves. So the navy blue is our baseline. The next line below that, the kind of cerulean, was our moderate recession. So the area between those 2 curves is the revenue at risk if we were to hit a moderate recession. And then the area between the top and the bottom line would be our revenue at risk if we were to hit a more protracted recession. Next slide. And then this is our spending side. So again, similarly, looking at the area between the curves, The bottom line here is our baseline, moderate is our middle line, and then protracted slump is that top line. Next slide. So this was our bottom line. So we estimated that the 5-year risk when we're accounting for both revenues and expenditures would come to somewhere between $1.7 billion and $4.6 billion. And then we do this calculation of buffers, which I'll talk about more in detail a little bit later. But basically our breakdown, we look at informal buffers and formal. And formal basically is our statutorily restricted rainy day funds. Informal is everything else, which we'll talk about in a minute. So informal buffers, we thought we had about $4.5 billion. Formal buffers, just under $1 billion. Our biggest informal buffer is what we call a working rainy day fund. So that's cash that's currently invested in infrastructure projects. We can take that out, issue bonds, and use the bond proceeds to backfill it. But obviously that does create future commitments. So that's just something to be aware of with looking at those buffers. So that's our normal process.
Great, thanks, Maddy, and thanks for just kind of laying that out in concept, the different types of data that you're using. Maybe when we get to the question portion of this event, we'll talk a little bit about how we can apply that to other states with different dynamics. But I'm hoping now you've got the slide up that we can talk about, well, how did you adapt this in the global pandemic? I mean, the baseline completely changed. No one, even in January of 2020, no one was anticipating a 7% decline in personal income. That just was not baked in, and it was, just completely outside of what any forecast, like reasonable forecast would have had in it. So given that comes into play, what did you do? So how did you adapt the stress test, and what were some of the results?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it was great that we had done several iterations of this before, so we had the process down. So it really looked quite similar. It was just a much more condensed time frame and a lot more stressful. So we met with our other entities, and first we decided we weren't going to run multiple scenarios. We just said, okay, what do we think? This was in June, we still don't really know what's coming, but at this point, what do we think is going to happen? So we estimated or assumed that it would be a 2-month severe shock followed by a moderate recovery, which is largely what we've seen so far. There's obviously still a lot of uncertainty, but this scenario didn't contemplate a double dip. So then we just ran our normal process. So each entity estimated economic indicators, we came to consensus on those, and then we estimated our effects on revenues and expenditures and came to consensus on those, again looking at that 5-year time frame. Next slide. Okay, so I just wanted to juxtapose our indicators that I showed previously. So this is what they looked like in the pandemic version. So here the navy line is our baseline for unemployment rate. The higher spike is what we forecast for our COVID scenario. And then I put in actuals just as far as we have data just to see how that was stacking up. And so the trajectory is very similar, but on a positive note, our unemployment spiked lower than what we feared, and it's actually had a sharper decline than what we were thinking. So that's some kind of good news so far. Next slide. And then wages. So Navy is our baseline. The line below that, the kind of cerulean, was our COVID forecast. So far, our actuals are actually above the baseline. We think a lot of that is due to the federal actions, the stimulus, and the extended unemployment benefits. So I don't know that trajectory is going to continue, but that's where we are so far. Next slide. Okay, so here are our results. So revenue side risk, the Navy is our baseline, and then the line below that is our COVID scenario. So we expected a huge shock in fiscal year 2020. It might look kind of weird to see that going up and almost meeting our baseline in 2021. That's primarily due to the shift in the income tax filing deadline. So that pushed a ton of money into the current fiscal year. And then also the stimulus action, so people having more money, spending it, then there's the lag in collections. So we did see that go up a little bit in 2021 in our forecast, drop back down in 2022, and then get on a stronger trajectory for recovery. Next slide. Okay, so then here's our expenditure side. So Navy's our baseline, the line above that is our COVID. So we expected a little bit more in terms of expenditures in fiscal year 2020, and then really seeing that sharp uptick in 2021 before it kind of levels off. Next slide. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about buffers here. So I think this is one of the really critical parts of this process, inventorying our buffers. And we categorize these based on ease of accessibility. So in that, we account for both statutory restrictions, how hard it is to actually access the money from that perspective, but also political will. So in our easily accessible category, we look at certain restricted accounts, working rainy day funds. So again, that's the cash that's in our infrastructure projects. Moderately accessible, we look at non-lapsing balances, unclaimed property, and certain earmarks. Somewhat difficult to access restricted fund balances, our capital improvements corpus, and some water loans. And then our difficult to access is primarily those formal rainy day funds and budget reserve accounts. Next slide. So here's our side-by-side, and just to note right off the bat that the y-axes are scaled differently. So on the left side is our 5-year value at risk. So accounting for both revenues and expenditures, we think worst case scenario, there would be $2.1 billion at risk. On the right-hand side, you see our 5-year budget reserves. And again, they're broken out the different colors based on their ease of accessibility. And we think we have over $4.5 billion in budget reserves over the course of 5 years, and actually a little bit over $2.5 billion in either the easy or the moderately easy to access category. And I think that is what gave our policymakers some comfort in such a scary and uncertain time, was to say, we think we have enough buffers in the easy and moderately easy to access category to cover our maximum 5-year value at risk. So I think that was one of the really important take-home points for this cycle. Next slide. So here in number form, our 5-year risk, we estimated somewhere between 1.2 and $2.1 billion. Informal buffers a little bit under 4 billion, and our formal buffers a little bit under $1 billion. And again, the same caveats in terms of the informal buffers and the working rainy day fund. So at this point, we have a lot of numbers, and we don't want to just throw them at our policymakers and say, have fun making these hard decisions. I mean, we're glad that they're the ones doing it, but as John alluded to, we have created this fiscal toolkit, and that came out of the Great Recession. So if you go to the next slide. So we have all these different options that policymakers could implement, and we have them based on the severity of the crisis, the volatility of our revenues and expenditures, and then the total value at risk. So items in the lower left corner are going to be easier to do. They're probably not going to require as much political will, potentially, fewer statutory restrictions. All the way up to the top right-hand corner, those are going to be really, really hard and are probably most appropriate for a situation that is incredibly dire. So I'm just going to run through these really quickly, and then I think Jonathan will talk about how we actually implemented them this year. So the temporal balance is just matching the timing or the term of revenues and expenditures. So balancing ongoing revenue with ongoing expenditures and one-time revenue with one-time expenditures. Cash flow management looks like carrying previous year balances into subsequent fiscal years, and this was a really critical piece for us this year. Spending reductions can be anything from, cutting existing programs, reducing programs, or putting off implementing new programs to a time in the future when there's more revenue available. Working rainy day funds, we've talked about that. That's our cash in our infrastructure projects. Operating reserves, that's utilizing unspent program balances, restricted account balances, and other buffers that are easier to access. Revenue enhancement would be things like raising taxes and fees, and then budgetary reserves is the hardest to access. So those are our formal rainy day funds, and the state has to be in a deficit to access those.
That's great, Maddy. So let's turn it back to John to help us to understand how this actually works kind of at the policymaker level. So we've seen kind of under the hood what some of the data are, what some of the results are. That toolkit, I do want to come back to talking about that toolkit. I think that's a really important piece of all of this. But John, help us bring it all together. How is this actually playing out during this pandemic? How are you using what you've learned? Oh, and you're on mute.
See, that's if somebody could have invented unmute me when I want you to unmute me, they'd make a lot of money. Next slide, please, Angela. If only the computer knew what I wanted. So let's talk about what we all went through these last 6 months or so. I know a little PTSD probably right now, but we'll talk about it anyway. Maddy mentioned the delay in income tax filing across fiscal years. Okay, this threw everybody for a loop. Like, the federal government apparently didn't know that all states, most states anyway, we connect our income taxes to their income taxes, and by their messing with timing, they messed with our timing. but they didn't really much care if they did know. And so we had to figure out how we were going to bridge, in our case, a $770 million funding shortfall in the short term. I think every other state with income tax had to do this. Then we had to face this immediate revenue loss that Maddy talked about, that 2020. We knew we were going to be short in 2020, and we only had, what, 4 months left at this point when we realized we were going to be short. And maybe, I mean, we didn't even fix this to June, so we had less than a month left when we had to fix this. So, you know, what are you going to do for that to fix that problem? Then, as I mentioned before, we had this issue where we made about $1 billion worth of new promises during the 2020 general session. And how are we going to address that? And then finally, not only do we have the one-time loss immediately in fiscal year 2020, but we knew if 2020 is going to be crappy, then 2021 is also going to be equally as crappy as 2020. And so maybe we wouldn't even be able to afford the things that we were paying for in the prior year. So next slide. Back to the toolkit. So this is where it got kind of, well, not kind of, it got super cool, like in a really nerdy way, but super cool. We just pulled out the toolkit. Like, we're facing all of these problems, and we just said to the bosses, we got you. Go worry about public health. We'll take care of this. And so the first thing we did is, as Maddy mentioned, we had been building positive cash flow for about 10 years. And that's, as Maddy mentioned, that was things like appropriating money after we collected it. So that's above surplus. We're talking about we would reserve hundreds of millions of dollars in the current year and spend it next year so that we had positive cash flow. It's also things like we forward fund all capital projects that are cash, right? So even though we know it takes 5 years to build a building, we put the entire amount in a bank for that, the cost of that project. So the first thing we did back in April is we went and grabbed all that positive cash flow. We delayed it 3 months or 4 months, and matched up our appropriations with the new revenue stream because of the delay in income tax filing. Super simple. Next transition. The next thing we did, as Maddy mentioned, not only did we have this cash timing issue that we could use to address the delay, we also could go borrow for those buildings, right? And so we're building a huge new prison complex in Salt Lake City, and we just said, the bosses said, you know what, we had paid cash for that. We're going to go ahead and finance part of that. State treasurer, go out and get some money and free up some cash so we can address that short-term budget shortfall, right? That immediate, we had 4 months. Let's fix it by going to borrow, get some really, really good. And by the way, we got sub 1% cost of money on this bond, so really, really good terms. Then the next transition. Then finally, this is actually pretty cool. Here we are in April. We just passed this big $1 billion increase in budgets in March. The bosses passed a resolution that said, hey, people, don't believe that budget we passed last year. We don't know what the new one's going to look like yet, but don't make any commitments. All that's gone. And we're going to spend the next 2 months figuring out how we're going to cut your budgets, but don't expect you're going to have it come July 1st. And then the other thing they did is they had actually built, beyond just having temporal balance where you match ongoing revenue with ongoing costs, they had actually flipped that on its head back in the general session, and they said, let's actually intentionally create a temporal surplus. Let's use ongoing revenue to pay for one-time costs, because we know that some of this revenue is not real, and we're going to have to come back to it later and you know, keep things going that we necessarily have to have. Okay, and then we spent 2 months going through budget cuts and having hearings, trying to figure out the CARES Act, and then come June, next transition, we passed a great big budget bill that pulled all these other levers. We enacted about $700 million worth of spending reductions. We authorized we cut the working rainy day fund, the cash side of it. So we'd gone out and borrowed the money in March. We cut the cash in June. We accessed about $40 million worth of operating reserves. So these are like non-lapsing balances and the like. We actually did use our rainy day fund at the end of fiscal year 2020 as a contingent appropriation. So we basically said, we're still not sure about these revenue estimates. Could be that we're even worse than we thought we were. And if we are, you can use the rainy day fund to pay for the difference. Turns out we never should have doubted Maddy and Andrea and Tom, because we were fine and we never had to use that. So that money's still in the budgetary reserve accounts, but it was a nice, it's a nice overdraft protection. And then finally, as Maddy mentioned, we did go back and grab that temporal surplus that we created during general session, so that we could keep promises to public ed and Medicaid. So that's how it was implemented, and really kind of fun, believe it or not.
Yeah,
Next slide.
I appreciate that you've provided those bills. If anyone's interested in looking to see how those are actually implemented, that's really helpful.
Yeah, those are all linked, and hopefully when we send out the PDF, you can go read the bills. It's enthralling. It's so riveting reading. All right, so this is the basically policy takeaway from all of that. If anybody's interested in statutorily how we did this, it wasn't in 1 year. We sort of did this over time, and with the help of Pew, and with the help of the Volcker Institute and the Laura John Arnold Foundation, a bunch of other people, everybody's got great ideas on this stuff. We came up with this 3-year plan to analyze and address volatility in government budgeting. It changes the way you think. And so I would just recommend everybody, the bill, we've shown you the bill here, you can go look at it, but we have a 3-year cycle. Every December, the first year we look at revenue volatility. By the way, that's this year for us. And then we make recommendations about how much money to put in the rainy day funds based on that volatility. The second year, we do a 5-year budget and talk about what are we going to need to address in the next 5 years, and do we have enough tax growth to match that? And then the third year, we do the stress testing, where we take the first 2 years and we throw these alternative scenarios in there and we blow it all up and see, could we survive a really bad economic event? So happy to talk about this further. We're about 7 minutes over time on the presentation. I want to get to questions, but thank you so much for hosting us and having allowing us to talk a little bit about this. We love this stuff, and we get really excited about presenting it, so glad to do it here.
Great. Well, thanks, John and Maddy, for such excellent information, and we've got some great questions that are coming in. I would encourage you to keep on submitting those questions using the question function on your screen. So I think I'm going to go ahead and just start a little bit more broad, and then we'll dive a little deeper to the current pandemic situation. But just generally, John, I want to understand, you're taking as there's staff resources, there's time that goes into this, there's very real decisions being made to take money off the table and put it into reserves. You showed that graph that had the actual spending and maybe what a stress test would lead policymakers to do in a baseline that was a little bit lower than the actual spending. And so I just want to kind of understand if you can provide some context for, given all of these competing demands and the very real in front of you needs in terms of health and welfare and public safety, isn't this just like another competing demand?
Yeah, I mean, I can understand how you would think that and how a policymaker might think that, right? But on the flip side, you don't have to necessarily put the money aside, right? At least you can just measure your value. You know what your risk is. You don't have to act. If you're in really dire circumstances in your state or local government, maybe you don't put money in a rainy day fund, but at least you know how bad things can get, and you can start thinking about what you would do in that situation, and maybe at least get the avoid the crisis decision-making part of the benefit, right?
Yeah.
But on the flip side of the two taking money off the table, there's a risk that you take too much money off the table, right? If you just
sure.
money into your rainy day account and like, I don't know, what is it? 5%? Sounds good. Let's just put in 5%.
Yeah.
By doing stress testing, you get a sense of what that value at risk is. You know when you've got enough and you can stop and feel comfortable about it and then put that money back in the economy.
Good. No, and that's helpful. And I said that was kind of a general question, but I think it actually even applies during this pandemic. I mean, if you say that a state does the methodology like right now and sees this large gap, but has to deal with Medicaid, I see what you're saying. Like it helps to kind of inform decision making. So thank you. And then Maddy, what's so kind of more general from the technical side of things, you've been involved in a number of these stress tests now in the Legislative Fiscal Analyst Office. Do you have any kind of takeaways? Like what have you learned in performing them a number of times and now actually performing like a pandemic scenario?
Yeah, absolutely. So this kind of answers that question. It also tags a little bit onto what John was saying, but in terms of taking too much money off of the table, part of our 3-year cycle, which he referenced on the last slide, was our volatility analysis. And so we conduct that on a 3-year cycle as well, and that tells us how volatile our revenue streams are, which then also informs how much money we're going to be putting into those reserve accounts. So I think that's just another useful tool that's part of our whole process and cycle to say, okay, we know we need to be putting some away, but just making sure we're not taking too much off the table. But back to kind of the more general, what have we learned? So again, like I said, I think doing this over several iterations, especially when we did it multiple times before we were looking down the barrel at something really scary, has been a really good process and learning experience. And so one of the things that I think we refined the most on this time around was really nailing down our buffers and making sure we were giving really precise numbers, because we don't want to throw numbers around to our policymakers and say, yeah, you've got this much money in the bank, and then when they go to get it, it's like, oh, well, just kidding, sorry. So I think where we had kind of had a patchwork process in inventorying those buffers before we really nailed that down this year, we made sure we were all on the same page, like, okay, if we're looking at earmarks, which one specifically are we looking at? Which restricted accounts are we looking at? Are we looking at the end of fiscal year balance? Are we looking at some other time frame? And then one of our other big things, which was John's idea, so I want to make sure he gets the credit for this, but like I mentioned before, our biggest informal reserve is our working rainy day fund. So that's cash and infrastructure. And I think in the past, we had kind of considered that as a one-to-one. So if we've got $600 million going into roads, we pull out that cash, then we've got $600 million to spend elsewhere, which is sort of true, but that doesn't account for the fact that we have to issue bonds to make up that money, and there are bond issuance costs and debt service costs and things like that. So that was something that we included in our model. This year, we just created a basic payment model to say, okay, just over the 5 years of the stress test, using an average interest rate, what are we going to be looking at for issuance costs and debt service costs? And then, so we still have our line that says $600 million in cash, but then we just have another line that says, okay, this is our debt service offset, just so we're not promising more money in those reserves than we actually have, or at least that we're accounting for the liabilities that we're creating.
Sure, perfect. That's very helpful. Thank you. So let's get into some of the details of the pandemic stress test. Let's see. We have one of our participants is asking if the estimate of risk, the $2.1 billion in risk, does that take into account federal aid? So you've done this assessment of revenue shortfall. You've done this assessment of expenditure increase. Have you included additional federal aid in your analysis?
No, and this was intentional. Like I mentioned, we spent all of May dealing with the CARES Act, and one of the additional costs in the stress test was Medicaid, right? Well, as part of federal stimulus, we all got enhanced FMAP, right? Well, the problem with enhanced FMAP is, especially this one, it's fleeting, right? It's only going to be around until we were done with the recession. So intentionally, when we set up the stress testing, we said, look, we don't think we're going to, well, first of all, we're Utah, okay? And if you're a Western state, you know what I'm talking about. We don't trust the federal government here. And we don't think that the federal government is going to be around to bail us out forever. And we can't always go to our rich uncle and ask for a check, even though that's what we're doing right now. So we intentionally did not include federal offset in the buffers or in the value at risk calculation. That has helped, but again, it's only for a little short time. The period of time we're worried most about in the pandemic stress test is not now, it's actually 2 years from now, when all of the federal stimulus dries up and we're left holding the bag in state government. And so now we need to start addressing all of those wants and needs that we don't have revenue for anymore.
That's great.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, and I think that you kind of bring up the, Utah policymakers and their, I don't know, the lens through which they view federal funding. That might vary from state to state. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that toolkit might vary from state to state. So there might be some state offices that would include federal, it would still have to be a projection, right? But some projection of federal aid in their buffers or, tools to deal with this. Maybe you could just talk about that toolkit and how that toolkit is, like, it's based on Utah experience, but perhaps that could be changed to reflect other environments in other states.
Yeah, so I talked to, and Maddy can go into more detail when I'm done. I'll just briefly say, I mentioned that enterprising young freshman legislator, who's now, by the way, Speaker of the House of Representatives. And we started the toolkit because he was like, all right, what did you do first? What did you do second? And we basically went through every bill from 2009, 10, 11, 12, and came up with what were all of our tricks back then. And then we started talking about, well, why did we do them in this order? And I think that's really where, of course, we had ARA back then too, right? So it's not in our toolkit, but that was, it was certainly something that saved us. We put these on this spectrum, on the ray that Maddy showed you in the toolkit. First of all, because I'm a wannabe economist and I wanted to draw a supply and demand curve, but also because it's meaningful in a political context for us. And those things might differ, like those tools might differ. Like you could have ARA on here, or you could have federal aid on here. And almost certainly the order in which you would access the tools will change, right? I mean, you might go right to revenue enhancement. That's the second to the last on our list, but that's all based on politics and on our experience in the past. But you might go to revenue, if you're a state that is more apt toward raising taxes, you might go to revenue enhancement first. And so that would be at the bottom of your toolkit. And maybe you got a budget reserves next, and you only cut budgets when it gets really bad. I mean, that's not, doesn't matter to me really what order they're in, but just having them there and recognizing them as tools, I think is super helpful so that you can start executing quickly. And give, we mentioned a couple of times, having this policy stability, super valuable for budget policy stability, super valuable for policymakers. I think even more valuable for businesses because they know that we're not going to be, jerking them around basically from a state policy perspective.
That's a good point. Thank you. Maddy, do you have anything to add?
I was literally going to use the exact same example on revenue enhancement just to make the point that I think probably all the tools that we're talking about are going to be relevant to most states, but it's really just the order. And then it also just depends on statutory restrictions, from state to state. But I would think that everything here would be relevant. And then your states may have other things that they would want to include as well.
Great. So the next question goes to the assumptions that underpin your pandemic scenario. And we know we've seen that cases have been rising in Utah. We know there's been some stabilization, but they're still quite high. and in other places across the US, the case as well. Do you think that the idea that there will not be a double dip is still accurate? You did that scenario, I guess it's been a couple of months now. Do you think that that's still an accurate kind of baseline, I guess, scenario, given the current circumstances?
I'm interested in the answer to this too, Maddy. Do you think those are still good?
I want to be a little bit diplomatic here. I mean, it's certainly a possibility. I think we've thought it was a possibility all along. I will say that we are in the process of doing our revenue forecasting right now, and so far the indicators are looking pretty positive. I think being economists, I tend to be more on the pessimistic side, and so I'm hedging my bets, I guess. But I think we've been looking at indicators just constantly all summer and tracking and making sure that we're not making claims that are just wildly outside of what we're seeing. So I know there's a chance that we would go there, and we're just constantly reassessing. That would be my.
I think that's a great answer. I think that, again, from my observation of what you're doing with budget stress testing is it's trying to assess the risk, and there's a whole variety of what that can look like, and then you've got a plan that you can ramp up or ramp down depending on what actually happens. So I think that's a good answer. Ask any economist, they'll give you a couple of answers. Kind of along the same. I don't want to hit other like along the same line of questions. Should things change that might push you into doing some sort of an update? Talk to us about what type of staff resources does that take? I mean, we're in an economic recession. We're in pandemic response. Your team, I know I'm friends and colleagues with many of the folks that work in your office. Isn't it time consuming to do this? Isn't it difficult? How do you balance all of that? At what point would you do another round of this?
Oh, that's a good question. So let me just say, Maddy can answer the time consuming part. But I will just say it has gotten easier with time. And so at first, yeah, it was super time consuming. We were plowing new ground, and we were trying to figure stuff out that we'd never done before. And you think about the revenue side, we had to go back and basically figure out on long-term revenues, how much of this volatility is due to policy change instead of economy. That took forever. But as we do this, just like with every other thing, it gets easier and we get more familiar with it. And Pew and the Gardner Institute helped us out a ton about a year ago by documenting what we did what was that, 2015 and 2016, the first two times we did it, and creating this user guide that's linked on the question slide here so that it could be easily replicable. So I don't know. I think it's worth it. I don't know. Maddy, is a lot of time? Do you feel like you're spending a lot of time on it? If you are, it's worth it.
Yeah, no, I think to John's point, we've definitely gotten more agile. And I will say that it feels like the legislative session never really ended this year, but that's not just because of this aspect of it. And I think, we have a very positive collaborative relationship with a lot of other entities in our state. So like John mentioned, the Gardner Institute, we work really well with the governor's office and the tax commission. And so being able to rely on other entities to collaborate on this sort of thing, I think is a huge positive aspect of this, and it makes it so that it's not so burdensome.
I would think of it this way, Juliette. Let me answer it this way. It takes some resources, okay? I'm going to say half an FTE, basically. It's just a guess. Half an FTE to do this across our three economists, and given how much time they do every year, okay? So, yeah, it takes some resources, but imagine how much time we saved between April and June in making decisions about the budget. first of all, just the fact that we were able to turn around within a month and find $770 million worth of cash flow to fix and then get that, let's just get that timing thing out of the way and not worry about it, right? I mean, we probably saved more than we spent on stress testing just for that one function.
Yeah. No, that's great. And so I work for the university now. I've worked in, gubernatorial office and also for the legislature. And these guys have heard me say a couple of times, I'm so thankful that I'm actually in their shoes right now after going through the Great Recession, because I just know how difficult and challenging and, the long hours and all of that. And I know that you definitely are living that right now, but I have seen how your preparation, I think, has helped you greatly. So thank you. That's really good context. Along the same lines, again, we're in the middle of it now. Who knows what happens in terms of a fall or winter surge, or maybe things turn around quicker than we anticipate. But I mean, we're dealing with all sorts of complexity in staff offices right now. Policymakers are trying to figure out how to meet all of this increased demand. What would your advice be for some of these states that don't currently have a stress testing practice in place? Do they start to lay the groundwork to do one when things settle? Do they do some piece of what you're doing now? Help provide some advice for states in this situation.
I guess we had this luxury of the 10-year runway, right? Where we were building up over time. And I guess if I were pressed right now, I would start at the end and work backwards. So I might start with my inventory of buffers. I might just start saying, okay, what's out there? We do this anyway when we're forced to cut budgets in a recession. So maybe before you get to the point, or maybe you're already at that point and it's too late, but I would go beyond whatever is necessary to meet the immediate needs and start inventorying all of your buffers and then categorizing them like that. I'd also say, go steal the work that we did that's out there. We created the stress testing user guides for this very reason. It's not, by the way, it's not perfect. Okay, so we would love to have feedback. If you guys go in there and you find something that doesn't work, or we're making some assumption that's wrong, I would love to know that so that we can improve it. But we've laid it out there, and I just invite people to go read it and call Maddy and ask her questions and see how you might do it. I don't know, Maddy, what else? What would you say?
Well, you stole my answer again. I think starting with the inventory of buffers is probably the most important. The only thing I would add to that is just assessing, every state relies on different revenue streams differently and has different big bucket expenditures, to an extent. And so I think even just having that conversation conceptually about, okay, which revenue streams are we relying on the most, and looking at the volatility or different scenarios with those, what are our biggest expenditures, but even just having a conversation about it, if you don't have the resources to start doing a more formal methodology right now, is going to be beneficial.
Excellent. Go ahead, John.
Right now, you could look at what you're doing to survive this, and then that'll start to inform your stress testing after we're out of this. Start just making a list of all the actions you're taking to get through this, like we did back in the early 2010s, 20-teens. Write them down as you're going, and then that'll start to inform, after we're done with this crisis.
That's great. That's really great advice. Thank you. Well, we're just at the end of the hour. I'm going to go ahead and just read you one comment in the question box. Rating agencies like stress testing regimen. I consider it credit positive. Another factor to consider in adopting the discipline. And that comes from Utah State Treasurer David Damschen. So just sharing that information with all of the participants. That's been in conversations that I've had with rating agencies. That's also been some of the messaging that I've received as well. So just wanted to share that with everyone. There are still a number of really great questions in the question box, but we just don't have time for them. But I know John and I know Maddy. I'm sure that they would be very willing to answer your questions by email if you want to forward them on. I'd also be happy to coordinate some of that as well, so you have all of our contact information. Thank you so much, John and Maddy, for your time, and thanks to everyone for participating, and I'll turn the time back to Angela.
Thanks, Juliette. So again, I just wanted to thank the three of you, Jonathan, Maddy, and Juliette, for being a part of today's webinar. It was really interesting and informative. Just a couple items as we wrap up. You will receive a survey about the webinar. We just appreciate it if you could respond. A recording of the webinar and the presentation materials will be posted to our website. And again, if you have any questions about the webinar or Pew's work on state and local fiscal help, my contact information is on the screen. Thank you again and have a great day.